Last but not least, we have Khwezi Gule, who is a curator and writer based in Johannesburg. He's currently the chief curator of Soweto museums. However, he participates in the symposium in his personal capacity. Khwezi.
Thank you. I will try to read from the screen. I should have printed it out. I was under the impression that I was going to be sitting at a reasonably high, the table was reasonable height. But anyway, I would like to start by an anecdote. Some few weeks ago, Mr. Babado presented artworks at the African Freedom Station, which were accompanying his book, which is now published, which is called The Akanya Ngoma, Portrait of a Jazz Classic. And during the Q&A session of the exhibition, a student here at Wits and a photographer, Muntu Vilagazi, asked in broad terms a question about whether or not one can trust white scholars with the narrative of black subjectivity. And the question, some interpreted it as veiled criticism of when Ansel was in the room. Now, afterwards, when we were talking, somebody asked me the question whether or not what to do with this kind of seemingly impossible idea of a black, of a white critic or black historian or white historian writing on black subjects, and of course of what to do with the colonial archive. And my response was, it depends on the kind of commitment the person has to that particular subject. And there are three particular ways which have been standard in quite a lot of people who have claimed authority over black subjects. One is that of a voyeur, the other one is that of a tourist, and the other one is that of what is the word I'm looking for? A peeping Tom, basically. So and why I say these things is because my sense is that what is required is an embeddedness in the texture of the life of the subject which you are trying to write about. So my response to the Black Modernism exhibition should be read along those lines, and why I feel it is a failure to have that embeddedness that I was referring to. So I'll just read. When I heard about the exhibition Black Modernism, I imagined an expansive exhibition and a sizable amount of text on the print, in print and in the exhibition space itself. So I was a bit surprised when I saw a small exhibition with no wall text apart from the title of the exhibition and this pamphlet. There is no harm in doing a modest exhibition, but I'm left to wonder, firstly, about why the hyperbole was necessary. Considering that the creator is best known, secondly, considering that the curator is best known for her work in what is termed African traditional art, I was certainly curious to understand how might she elucidate on her foray into black modernism, and what precisely she means by the use of this term in the context of this exhibition. Certainly there isn't much to go on that could provide me with any clues. This is more than a bit disturbing, because in the absence of a proper articulation of what is being meant by these terms, no thorough critical engagement can exist. Having said that, there are a number of approaches one can take to think through what is meant by this very loaded term, black modernisms. The pamphlet that accompanies this exhibition has been illuminating for a number of reasons. I will mention 4 recurring themes. One being the writer's reliance on the art historical model as a way of explaining artist production, which, with its binaries, e.g. figuration/abstraction. B, the writer's foregrounding of apartheid and colonial context as a precondition for production. C, the mentioning of white tutelage/mentorship and patronage as inspiration for artists. And 4th is the absence of any other endeavors of the artists on the exhibition. For instance, Sylvie Mvusi, in addition to being an artist, was also a scholar of African art. Sekoto was a musician, and in fact, many of the artists mentioned were teachers who produced significantly different pedagogies of art. Some time ago, I was involved in a roundtable discussion, and I'm mentioning this now because I think it goes some way towards explaining this kind of shift from this so-called traditional art to this so-called black modernisms. Some time ago, I was involved in a roundtable discussion for the Guide General of Contemporary Art, where a number of curators of museums which had been ethnographic museums were grappling with the issue of transforming themselves in the wake of the attack that ethnography and anthropology had sustained in the latter part of the 20th century. In South Africa, many of the collections of art by black artists are implicated in the histories of racial and ethnic classificatory systems that sadly persist even to this day. While it is true that some of the museums involved in the rethinking of these collections and in the ways that have been framed, it is also important that there are cautions, that we are cautious once again to simply repeat the same mistakes under the guise of new terminology. In relation to this, the issue is relevant to ask whether the people who have in the past upheld the approaches to ethnography are indeed to be trusted to provide a different way of looking at art by black artists. And I'd also like to question the term black modernism in favor of African modernism. The distinction being that African modernism links us to the larger anti-colonial and post-colonial dialogue. Secondly, I want to uphold the term black artist, which speaks of black subjectivity and agency. We need to delineate between modernism as an art movement and modernity as the economic and social epoch in the history of humanity. Modernism is concerned with primarily the artistic styles in particular the avant-garde. It forms part of a largely self-referential system of knowledge and discipline, which is history of art. On the other hand, modernity is a period that is marked by other things, among other things, departure in Europe from monarchies to modern states. This shift is also made possible by the transatlantic slave trade and colonial project. This is important because in the tumultuous period beginning in the Enlightenment of the 17th century also produces the pseudo-scientific classificatory systems and knowledge systems that sustain European dominion over the rest of the world. The same gospel that produced the notion of equality among men also produces the gospel of inequality for women, non-Europeans, and ethnicities. In this sense, whereas African art can be looked at African art can be looked at in relation to modernist art movements, it can be more productively be looked at through the lens of, or by thinking through what makes African art or art made by black artists modern. I argue that to do this, one needs to look not only at African subjectivity and black subjectivity with its ruptures, continuities, and turns. Thembinkosi has often argued that, Thembinkosi Gule has often argued that rushing too quickly to the biographies of artists and the socio-political context of production as a primary way of accessing the artwork tends to limit the artwork and the imagination. He further argues that it is to overburden the work with the responsibility of answering every other person's expectations of the artwork. This has constantly been the fate of black artists. By saying so, however, he is not advocating for a reading that simply focuses on aesthetics to the exclusion of the political. A few weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to attend a panel discussion that was held in the context of the Omar Badr Retrospective Exhibition at Museum Africa. There were two moments for me that stood out. One was the point at which Goniwe, who was a member of the panel, illustrated how abstract art, like jazz, collapses form and content. To give concrete expression to this proposition, he had musicians at the talk play a short piece of jazz to the audience. The second moment came when Omar Badsha was explaining his artistic approach and that of Dumili's approach to making art. He said that what they were doing was trying to find the language with which they could speak to, as he put it, our people. The idea of a language that is continually in the process of formation is what ultimately, for me, defines the project of African modernity. It is a process that is in part a response to colonialism, but cannot be limited to simply being a product of colonialism. The times at which distinct forms of African modernity emerge across the arts are also instances when Africans are finding new languages to articulate themselves to themselves. It is in this sense that the African Renaissance has been an ongoing process which bubbles up from time to time, and in the works of early modernists, in the various iterations of jazz movements and more contemporary music genres. Therefore, for me, looking at the broader histories of African modernity suddenly opens up much more varied ways of looking at the work of black artists than confining them in the straitjacket of the modernist art history. Lwazi Lushaba, in a recent colloquium which was titled Art and Politics, articulated this in a different way by proposing that the project of decolonizing is doomed to failure if Africans continue to define colonialism as the starting point of their history, rather than a specific period in the larger history of the continent. Lushaba further argues that decolonization of South African universities cannot be left to the present crop of academics because they rely on the same knowledge base that has always informed their scholarship. In her response to Recipe Press article by Landile Fikeni, Anitra Hilton makes the point of mentioning that she has taught African art and taught in places like Funda and Fuba for no charge. For me, this is not instructive at all. What it reveals is a claim to authority on African art that says very little about the quality of the teaching and the systems of knowledge that underpin that teaching, and in fact only manages to sound paternalistic. You know that a writer considers, and I'm referring again to the pamphlet here, and the title of the exhibition, you know that a writer considers something a deviation from the norm when they put a qualifying adjective next to a word, e.g., white poverty, female pilot, and in this particular exhibition, the term black is very telling. This in itself is not a serious indictment in my estimation. It is rather that the black in the title, what it is that the black in the title implies. And the pamphlet that was produced is again instructive. Firstly, one is never sure what the term black is in the pamphlet refers to, because again of the lack of other evidence that suggests what it might mean. Whether it is used as a descriptor that is equivalent to a black cat, a red car, or a yellow house. Or if it is being used to denote a historical subject that only comes into being in the context of colonialism and apartheid, or a subject that is a being in itself and more importantly for itself. The feeling I get is that the author's pamphlet probably see the black artists they are talking about and their artworks solely as products of history. The constant reference to the kinds of tutelage and the artists are said to have received or didn't receive, and the recurring references to colonial and apartheid context in which the artists produced their work, the tendency to over-determine the way in which the artwork of these artists tend to over-determine the way in which these artists are written about. Again, this in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a red flag. To paraphrase Goniwe again, even when one considers the ways in which white domination affected black people, one needs to constantly remember that black people exist in spite of the history of domination, not because of it. In other words, black experience, however you may define it, cannot be reduced to the byproduct of oppression or even white patronage. The second implication with term black modernism is that there was a modernism that stands as a reference point to all other modernisms.